This furniture flip is going to be a little bit controversial, and if you don't like to see vintage/antique pieces like this being painted, then I advise scrolling on. This buffet was listed on Facebook Marketplace for free because it had a broken leg, and the guy actually said it'd just be used as firewood if no one came to get it, so I had to go and save it. This one was made out of solid mahogany and mahogany veneer, but as you can see, this leg was hanging on for dear life. There was not a lot of timber actually left on the internal part of that leg, but it was definitely worth a shot to try and fix it. My first step on this flip was to remove the bonnet so that I could flip the piece over and get a really good look at what was actually going on here. There was some intact dowels. The dowels on one side had snapped, and there was just this random screw where obviously someone had tried to repair it in the past. Originally, this back section here would have been doweled into the leg, so I needed to secure it back onto the body of the piece. So I'm drilling 2 pilot holes so that I could come back once everything was glued in place and secure it down with some timber screws. I then moved to the side of the piece where I had the split in the timber where the dowels were actually going in, and used a paintbrush and some Selleys Aqua Adhere glue to glue that into place before clamping it down. I wiped off the excess on that section before putting some glue onto the actual leg as well, so all over the dowels. It got a little bit drippy there. Put it into place, moved that back section around. Once I had it where I wanted it, I clamped it down, and then I used those 2 pilot holes as a guide to screw in 2 timber screws so that everything was secure. This next part may have been a little overkill, but because there was so much timber missing from the internal part of the leg, I decided to cut a little piece of timber down that I could wedge behind that section for added support. I secured it into place with some timber screws. I filled anything that looked gappy with some sawdust and wood glue and added a couple of extra screws just for good measure. I allowed that leg to dry for a good 24 hours before flipping it over so that I could start removing the existing finish that was on top of the piece. To do this, I'm using my carbide scraper or tungsten carbide blade, which is essentially a very sharp blade that you scrape across the surface of the piece to remove the finish. Before I started sanding everything down, and after I'd used my carbide blade, I went around with some vinegar and water to give the piece a thorough clean. It may sound counterintuitive to clean a piece down prior to sanding because you're going to have to come back and remove the dust anyway, but what cleaning down does is remove all the dirt, grease and grime that may be sitting on the surface. This piece is older. You can imagine how many people have touched it over the years. We have skin oils. It may have been cleaned down with something that contains oils, and it is secondhand after all. You don't know how people store their furniture or what's being stored on it. So it's always a good idea to remove that because sanding actually creates a lot of friction, and friction creates heat. Heat disperses oils. So all you're going to do if you don't clean is drive all of that gunk further down into the timber, which will hinder your finishes from adhering to the surface effectively later on in your refinishing process. I sanded the top down with 120 grit sandpaper followed by 180, and then I finished with 240 grit sandpaper. For the top of this piece, I really wanted to focus on enhancing that grain pattern, and one of the ways that you can do this is by graining the timber. Now what this does, it's using a wire brush to remove some of the softwood. So where you see those little dark grain lines, they will remain, but the lighter timber that is around those grain lines, those rings, will be removed. Wire brushes will not scratch the surface of the timber. In fact, they will do the opposite and start to polish it. However, when you do this technique, you do need to make sure that you are following the grain of the timber and that you are consistent across the whole surface of the piece. This is one of those trust the process techniques. You'll see what I mean in the end. Once I'd finished graining the top, I moved on to scuff sanding the body of the piece where I was going to be painting. Now, scuff sanding is essentially creating a key or some micro texture on the surface so that your primer will adhere to the surface effectively. What you're aiming for with your scuff sanding is for the surface to look milky or matte. So I did a side-by-side comparison so that I could show you. I haven't scuff sanded the bottom of this piece, but I have scuff sanded the top. So you can see that gloss, that shine on the bottom, but up the top where I have scuff sanded, you get no gloss, no shine. It's a matte finish. After removing all of the dust, it was time to prime my piece, and I always like to do a test patch before I spray anything onto my furniture to ensure that my spray pattern is coming out how I want it to, that my dilution is on point, and that the weather isn't doing anything funky to the spray pattern. I'm using Zinsser water-based primer here because I'm going to be spraying my piece a darker color in the end, and I'm not worried about tannin bleed. And if you've been following me for a while, you would have heard me bang on about tannin bleed, and I wanted to give you a visual on this piece. Now you can see these dark shadows, this weird yellowing around the detail. This is tannin bleed, and tannin is a naturally occurring property in the timber that only manifests when you put water onto the surface. So it's something that actually leaches out when you put water-based products onto the timber. And the only way to stop this from coming out into your paintwork is to use an oil or a shellac-based primer. Once that primer was completely dry, I went around lightly with 600 grit sandpaper to give the piece a sand down, and this just removes any texture or anything that may have landed in the paintwork while it was drying, and then moved on to doing a test patch for my final paint color. I'm using Porter's Paint's Aquasatin in the color Aniseed for this piece, and this is a water-based enamel paint, so it's especially hard wearing. You don't need a top coat, and it's incredibly easy to apply. I did a total of 2 coats of the Aquasatin on this piece, sanding in between with 600 grit sandpaper. Once my paintwork was completely dry, it was time to get that top finished. Now, I had grained the timber, I had that beautiful texture, but this is me actually doing a wet test, and you can do this with water or you can do it with methylated spirits, but what it does is it mimics what your timber is going to look like once it has been sealed. So you can see that really rich orange red tone coming through, which some people love, but for this piece I didn't like the contrast. I wanted that timber to look more like what it did when it was freshly sanded. To maintain that freshly sanded but to still have it sealed in the end, I'm going to apply a paint wash using these 2 colors, and as you can see, that bottom tone is very similar to what the mahogany looked like when it was freshly sanded. For those that are unfamiliar, a paint wash is essentially applying a watered down mix of paint to the surface of the timber to change its tone. You can see here that I'm applying with the grain. I'm using a microfiber cloth. I come back over after around 10 seconds of that product sitting on the piece with an old dry t-shirt to wipe off the excess. I speed up my dry time with a hairdryer, and then I sand in between each coat with 600 grit sandpaper. Paint washing has the power to absolutely change the look of timber. No longer are you stuck with a particular tone because you have a particular timber, and I've created a guide through the link in my bio which will teach you everything that you need to know about paint washing. While that final paint wash coat was drying, I used 240 grit sandpaper to subtly distress the details that were on the front of the doors. So you can see here that I'm just hitting the high points of the detail. I'm not doing too much, just a few fine lines, just to add a little bit of dimension back into that carved section. The handles on this piece were electroplated, so they weren't a solid brass. Whatever they had been electroplated with, be that a gold or a brass tone, was wearing off, which was fine because I didn't want a shiny handle on this set. I wanted something that was a little bit more aged, a little bit more lived in. So I gave them a good clean in some hot soapy water and then used my brass wire wheel on my drill just to polish up the high points of the handles, similar to what I did on the front of the doors, just to add a little bit of dimension on the detail. Getting back to the top of the piece, I wanted some depth of color up here, but I also wanted to add a little bit of shadowing to that grain pattern that I had deepened with the wire brush. So I mixed up a custom tinted hardwax oil shade. This is using the FIDDES tinted hardwax oil range in the color Rustic Oak and Oak Lightning, and this is a really beautiful subtle mid-brown tone. I buffed it in with an old rag, really just making sure that I was working it into that deepened grain. While that was drying, I reinstalled the old hardware, and once the shadow coat was completely dry, I moved on to apply 2 coats of FIDDES hardwax oil in matte clear. This is straight after that second coat was applied. It looks quite shiny now, but it does dry down to a beautiful satin finish, but you can also see the shadow that tinted hardwax oil has created. It really seeps down into the grain and creates a lot of contrast, and it just makes the grain pop. This is once the hardwax oil is completely dry, and now you know exactly what graining does. Watch as the camera moves across, so you've got the texture in the light and then it switches to a shadow as it's moving back. So you see that shimmer, that texture of the timber grain, but you also get that contrast, that shadow in the color. So guys, just a reminder of where we were on this one. And this is where we are now. Let me tell you, I am so happy that I took a chance on that broken leg and saved this piece from being burnt in a bonfire. There's so many subtle elements to it. You have that beautiful timber grain up top, the contrast between the timber tone and the paint color. The handles are stunning. They work really well with the distressing on the front of the doors. But as always, I would love to know what you guys think. So jump in the comments and let me know if you think this one is a nail or a fail. And antique furniture lovers, be kind. This was going to be burned on a bonfire after all.